Hello and welcome to this D&D History Hub podcast. My name is David, and in this episode I'm going to talk about the surprisingly modern tactics employed by William the Conqueror to dominate his new subjects after his victory over the Anglo-Saxons at the Battle of Hastings. If you enjoy this presentation, please consider subscribing and giving us a like. It will all help as we seek to improve this channel. Okay, so William of Normandy's war against the Anglo-Saxons didn't end with his victory at the Battle of Hastings in October 1066. It lasted many years, and it involved much violence and brutality. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles said this of William: "A hard man he was and fierce, no man dared against his will." So William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066 in Westminster Abbey, and he formulated a remarkable plan to bring the Saxons to heel and to do his bidding. It was a brutal plan, but also very sophisticated in a way that foreshadows the rise of dictatorships in the 20th century. You see, Marxist philosophers and later some of the postmodernists discussed how language and cultural symbols could be manipulated to define a new reality. For instance, the Italian Marxist intellectual Antonio Gramsci used the term cultural hegemony, that is, ways in which a ruling class can dominate and manipulate a society's culture. I've put a link below for more information on Gramsci if you want to follow that up. But William instinctively understood this stuff. He made it his overriding goal to destroy Anglo-Saxon culture and society. He was determined to dominate the discourse, as the postmodernists might say. That is, he wanted them thinking the way he wanted them to think. And William didn't mess around. He employed murder, famine, violence, and coercion to achieve his goals. It's been estimated that in the 20 years between 1066 and 1086, around 200,000 Normans and French people settled in the country. In contrast, at least 300,000 English people, that's 1 in 5 of the native population, were killed in William's ravages or starved after he expropriated their animals and their land. Now, let's just take a quick look at England before the conquest. It wasn't any kind of paradise, but neither was it any kind of hell. Life was simple and often short. It could be rough, tough, and violent. Nevertheless, the people raised their children, cared for their animals, they worked the land, they knew its ways, and they knew that good times invariably would be followed by hard. They had a word for this: wyrd, W-Y-R-D, meaning what will be, will be. Now, in 1066, it had been around 700 years since the Roman conquerors had left. So, just think back from now, today, 700 years. It's going to take you back to around the 15th century. That seems like a hell of a long time ago to us. But it can seem like just a blink of an eye when we read a standard history of the Anglo-Saxon period. It all becomes telescoped, the rise of Christianity, the incursions and migrations by Anglo-Saxons, Jutes and Vikings, and the frequent small wars and battles. But that distorts things a bit, because in that time, in those 700 years, a multifaceted Anglo-Saxon society and culture developed. It produced the likes of the monk, historian and poet, the Venerable Bede, the brilliant scholar Alcuin of York, genius King Alfred the Great, and that other outstanding leader, Ethelstan. He also produced some great and unrivaled poetry. You just think of Beowulf, the Wanderer, and the elegiac The Seafarer. We know that Beowulf in particular, but Anglo-Saxon culture in general, had a profound influence on, for example, J.R.R. Tolkien in his writing of the classic The Lord of the Rings, especially his construction of the Rohirrim, and that was the Marc, which I think is a loan word from the Anglo-Saxon. Now, there's something else that tells us about life in England at that time, and that's the Julius work calendar, which laid out in beautiful and touching detail the everyday routines and tasks of the ordinary people. So the Anglo-Saxon society of 1066 wasn't some kind of incomplete culture waiting to be fulfilled by the Normans. I'm not idealising it. It could be rough, tough, and deadly. Pre-conquest England had been subject to invasions and incursions by raiders and settlers from Northern Europe and Scandinavia for many years. Vikings began raiding late in the 8th century, began with small bands bent on plunder, but by the late 9th century, large organised armies pillaged and plundered and clashed with the armies of successive Saxon kings, such as the famed King Alfred. But many of these Vikings never went back to Scandinavia. They stayed and settled mostly in northern England. My home city, the city of York, in Yorkshire, of course, is a classic example of an old Viking city. And today its great Jorvik museum allows us really special insights into the life of these people. And they were, I've seen a lot of the discoveries that were made in there. They weren't all barbarians. They had a quite sophisticated culture. The ruling elite of the day certainly were not pure of heart and soul. King Harold, had he lived, may well have been an exemplary ruler. We will never know. But his family were almost a sort of mafia. Harold's father, Earl Godwin of Wessex, was a cutthroat survivor who privileged himself and his family, and Harold's wayward and treacherous brother Tostig was a nasty piece of work. But it's worth noting that he was roughly ejected from his position as a sort of leader in Northumbria by the people when they'd had enough of his rapacious and bad boy ways. And so, after Hastings, William began his cultural conquest. He imposed changes to the churches and government, kicking out the Saxons and bringing in his Norman henchmen. By 1070, much of England was under Norman control. As Winston Churchill records in his History of the English-Speaking Peoples, the track north of William's army was marked for generations upon the countryside, and in the memories of survivors and descendants. From coast to coast, the whole region was laid desolate. For long years after, tales were told of the waste and of the rotting bodies of the famine-stricken by the roadside. By 1075, as part of this cultural revolution, Norman castles guarded the towns. Norman lords were in charge of the lands, and Norman churches protected the souls of people. Bishops and abbeys and other high posts were now, as a matter of course, given to Normans, and the insular customs were supplanted by the latest fashions from abroad. Anglo-Saxon churches, generally made of wood, were knocked down and replaced by stone buildings. Stone castles were erected to dominate the towns. William's new Archbishop Lanfranc reshaped church life by demanding that the people support not only William, but also the Pope. Lanfranc kicked out Anglo-Saxon clerics to be replaced by Normans. William was not the kind of person to employ tact and persuasion. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles say this of him: a hard man he was, and fierce. No man dared against his will. And so in 1069, William and his knights unleashed a genocidal attack on large tracts of northern England. It's an atrocity known as the harrying of the North. I have another video about this that I'll leave a link to if you want more information on that. But they laid waste to the land, they slaughtered livestock and condemned many thousands of people to die slowly and painfully of starvation, including children. The people of the North suffered terribly in William's outrages, but he also found the time to harass other parts of England too. The author David Howarth notes in his book 1066, The Year of the Conquest, that all England suffered in one way or another under the yoke of a cruel foreign tyranny. The 11th century monks who wrote the relevant part of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles had this to say of William: he had castles made and oppressed poor men. The king was very hard, and took of his underlings many marks of gold, and many more hundreds of pounds of silver. Into avarice he was fallen. The rich complained, the poor lamented. But he was so hard, he set their hates at naught. The chronicler and Benedictine monk Odric Vitalis says this about the fate of the North. In his anger, William commanded that all crops and herds, chattels and food of every kind should be brought together and burnt to ashes with consuming fire, so that the whole region north of the Humber might be stripped of all means of sustenance. So terrible a famine fell upon the humble and defenceless people that more than 100,000 Christian folk of both sexes, young and old alike, perished of hunger. William the Conqueror was violent, but he also knew all about cultural hegemony, and perhaps he even invented it, as he asserted his authority throughout England by publishing new laws and new codes. And then, in around 1086, he unleashed a new weapon: bookkeeping and accountancy. He wanted to dominate the culture by ensuring that he owned it. And so William bequeathed to us the famed Domesday Book, in which he sent his men over all of England, into each shire, to count and collate what everyone owned. About 20 years after the Battle of Hastings, around 1,000 individuals held their land directly from the king, a mere 13 of whom were English. So Domesday therefore reveals cataclysmic changes to the composition of England's ruling class, with Normans replacing native lords in almost every village and hamlet. Whereas in 1066 there had been several thousand middling English thanes, by 1086 half the land in England was held by just 200 Norman barons, writes the author Marc Morris. I'll give a link to all the books mentioned in here, quoted from me, down below. The Norman aristocracy was now firmly in charge, and over time they would see to it that England became more efficient, methodical and ruthless in pursuit of its goals, both national and international. William died in 1087. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles left this epitaph. Truly, in his time, men had much oppression and many injuries. They also had to learn new ways of being and doing, because William had also won the culture war. Thank you.